The afternoon couldn't have been more peaceful. The kind of slow, golden day you wish you could bottle and save for later. Sunlight spilled over Grandma Joyce's front porch like honey, warming the old wood planks and catching in the edges of the freshly watered flower beds. Her roses were in full bloom, pinks, reds, oranges so deep they looked like they were on fire. Grandma rocked back and forth in her favorite chair, a glass of sweet tea sweating on the table next to her. Her face was tilted toward the sun, that familiar look of pure satisfaction she got when she knew all her hard work was paying off. The neighborhood was unusually quiet for a Saturday. No leaf blowers, no kids screaming, just the soft clinking of wind chimes and the low buzz of bees. Even the air smelled sweet, a mix of cut grass and honeysuckle. I was on the front fence, paintbrush in hand, slathering on a new coat of crisp white, careful to get into all the grooves. The paint fumes mixed with the humid air, creating that oddly satisfying smell of fresh work being done. Brandon was nearby, sanding down one of the fence posts, his sleeves rolled up, revealing tan arms crisscrossed with old scars and tattoos. He didn't say much, he almost never did, but his steady presence was like having a tank parked beside you. Unshakable. Solid. It was the kind of day where you could almost believe nothing bad could ever happen here. If you didn't know him, you might think Brandon was just another guy doing chores. But once you looked closer, you'd notice it, the way he moved, the way his eyes constantly scanned, never fully relaxing. Brandon was a combat veteran, Iraq, 3 tours. The kind of soldier the military tried to build and only sometimes managed to. He didn't like talking about it much. I knew bits and pieces, enough to understand that he'd been through some hell I couldn't imagine and had come back carrying it all in a locked vault somewhere inside him. But despite the rough edges, he had a gentleness, especially around Grandma. It was in the way he carefully shifted her heavy flower pots so he wouldn't disturb the roots, or how he automatically cut the fence boards a half-inch longer because he knew she liked the chunky look. People like Brandon didn't do things halfway. If he was on your side, he was all in. That day, painting fences and sipping sweet tea, it felt like the world had finally given him a small, well-earned pocket of peace. Neither of us knew how fast that was about to change. It started with the crunch of tires on gravel. Slow, deliberate. I looked up from my brushstrokes just in time to see a matte black SUV creeping down the street. No markings. No plates that I could see. Windows tinted so dark they practically sucked in the sunlight. It wasn't normal. Not here. Pine Ridge Estates was the kind of neighborhood where you recognized every car on the block. Mrs. Langley's bright yellow Mini, Mr. Cruz's battered Ford pickup. This SUV didn't belong. I noticed Brandon freeze. Not in a panicked way, more like a hunting dog catching the scent of something wrong. He set the sander down without a sound, wiped his hands on his jeans, and watched. Eyes narrowing. Shoulders tensing just slightly. The SUV coasted to a stop right in front of Grandma's house. The driver's door cracked open, and 2 men stepped out. Both wearing crisp polo shirts and khaki pants. Both with lanyards and clipboards, cheap ones, like you'd get from a dollar store. They had the look of people trying way too hard to seem official. Brandon didn't say a word, but I saw the vein in his jaw tighten. He knew before I did, whatever this was, it wasn't good. The first guy was tall and wiry, sunglasses perched cockily on his nose. The second was stockier, with a slight limp he tried to hide. They moved with fake confidence, the kind you see in mall security guards who think they're on SWAT teams. The tall one flicked through his clipboard like he had an actual list. "Afternoon," he said, flashing something that vaguely looked like a badge. "Too shiny, too flimsy. We're with the Pine Ridge Estates Homeowner Compliance Division." Routine check. Grandma frowned from her rocker, setting down her tea. "Never heard of that before," she said. "And I been here 32 years. The stocky one chimed in. "New initiative. Fast tracking code enforcement. We've been authorized to issue citations on the spot for non-compliant properties." Brandon's hands were at his sides, but I could tell he was ready. Every fiber of him was coiled tight, waiting. They started rattling off violations. The wind chimes were a noise disturbance. The roses were obstructing pedestrian access, even though they were 3 feet from the sidewalk. The mailbox paint was faded and non-compliant, even though we'd just painted it last month. They finished with a threat. if the violations weren't remedied immediately, they were authorized to take corrective action. Translation: they were going to start ripping things out. Maybe even force their way inside. Grandma, bless her, stayed calm. She just looked them over and said, "You boys are barking up the wrong tree." Brandon hadn't moved, but his presence had. It felt like a wall had gone up between the house and the imposters, and he was the wall. The tall one stepped closer, cocky now that he thought we were just a bunch of harmless civilians. He jabbed his clipboard toward the porch. "That doorbell camera," he sneered. "Not registered with the association. That's a $500 non-compliance fine." It was ridiculous. The HoA had no such rule, and even if they did, nobody had ever mentioned anything about registration. It was pure intimidation. Brandon's voice broke the tension. Low. Controlled. Deadly serious. "You're not touching this property," he said. The man blinked, caught off guard by how calm and how absolutely certain Brandon sounded. Stocky shifted uneasily, glancing toward the SUV like he wanted to retreat. But Tall wasn't backing down. He planted a foot on the first step of Grandma's porch. Brandon took one step forward. Just one. But it felt like an earthquake. "I'm only going to say this once," he said. "Step away from the house." Now. You could feel it, the shift. The way the temperature dropped even though the sun was still shining. The way the birds, the bees, the whole neighborhood seemed to pause, holding its breath. The men didn't listen. They should have. Brandon's stance had shifted, just a little. The way he tilted his head slightly, eyes narrowing. It was the same look he had when he sized up a threat back in his military days. It was like flipping a switch, from calm handyman to combat ready. The two men took a step back, as if sensing the change in the air. But the tall one, clearly thinking he could still bluff his way through, puffed out his chest and sneered. "You think we're scared of you," he said, his voice growing sharp. "We'll report you, make sure the HoA knows about your military tactics here. You don't want to deal with the fallout." Brandon didn't respond immediately. He simply took one more step forward, his boots quiet on the gravel, but with an undeniable force. "I don't want to deal with anything from you two," he said evenly. "But if you don't leave right now, you're going to wish you'd never come here." The tall one froze. He looked over at his partner, probably searching for a way out. But Stocky wasn't as quick to back down. He planted himself between Brandon and the front porch, hands resting on his hips. "You don't get to threaten us," Stocky said, his voice shaky but still trying to hold some authority. "We're here on official business. You'll regret this." I felt the air thicken, like it was heavy with electricity. Grandma, ever calm, just sat back in her chair, her fingers tapping lightly on the armrest, watching. She could see it too, the storm that was coming. The tall one took another half-step forward, and that's when I saw it, Brandon's hand, almost imperceptibly moving toward his pocket. Not a threat, but a promise that the situation was about to escalate. Then, in a flash, it happened. The tall man made a lunge, not at Brandon, but toward Grandma's old rocking chair. His hand came down hard on the armrest. That was the line. Brandon moved faster than I could blink. He shoved the man backward, not with a push, but with a force that made him stumble and crash onto the concrete driveway. Stocky scrambled to move, but Brandon was on him in a heartbeat. He didn't punch, he just grabbed him by the collar and spun him around, slamming him into the SUV. There was a sharp metallic clang as the back of the man's head connected with the vehicle, and Stocky went limp for a split second, dazed. It was over in a moment. But that was just the beginning. For a second, everything was still. The SUV, the men, the neighborhood, even the wind, all suspended in that charged silence. And then it hit me. Brandon wasn't just defending the house. He was protecting Grandma. He was keeping them from crossing the threshold, from doing something even worse. His instincts had kicked in long before I'd figured out what was at stake. The tall one, still flat on the ground, looked up at Brandon with wide eyes. His hands were outstretched, palms up. He looked terrified. "I don't want trouble," he shouted. "I just follow orders." Stocky, still crumpled against the SUV, grunted, rubbing the back of his head. His face had turned a deep shade of red, and his jaw was clenched in pain, but he wasn't completely out of it. Brandon didn't speak. He just stood there, eyes locked onto the two men. The tension in the air was palpable. It felt like the whole world was holding its breath, waiting for something to give. Then Stocky groaned, shifting to get back on his feet. "You'll pay for this," he muttered, his voice hoarse. "You don't know who we work for." That's when Brandon smiled, but it wasn't the kind of smile that made you feel safe. It was the smile of a man who'd already won. "I don't give a damn who you work for," Brandon said, his voice low and even. "Get in your car. Leave. Now." The words hung in the air like a final judgment. They didn't need to be told twice. Stocky and Tall scrambled to their feet, tripping over each other in their haste. They rushed toward the SUV, throwing open the doors and jumping inside. I watched as the black SUV roared to life, tires screeching against the asphalt as they peeled out of the driveway, racing down the street like their lives depended on it. And for a moment, it felt like everything was back to normal. But the calm didn't last. The adrenaline still surged through me, my heart pounding in my chest. I glanced over at Brandon, who was already wiping his hands on his pants, the same quiet intensity in his eyes. Grandma didn't say anything at first. She just sat there, her gaze fixed on the empty street, as if processing everything in her own way. After a moment, she slowly set down her tea and looked up at us. "Well," she said, her voice almost too calm, "looks like you boys made quite an impression." I chuckled nervously, but it didn't feel like a real laugh. That was something. Brandon didn't respond. He just turned, walking back to the fence and picking up the sander like nothing had happened. I looked over at Grandma, who was now standing up, stretching out her back as she moved toward the porch steps. "That wasn't an accident," she said softly. "They were after something. Something more than a few petty fines." I nodded. The realization sank in slowly. Whoever those guys were, they weren't just working for a fake HoA. They were after something connected to this house. "Do you think they'll come back?" I asked, my voice suddenly uncertain. Grandma looked at me, her face serious. "If they do, we'll be ready." The next few days were a blur of questions. Brandon and I kept our heads low, continuing with our repairs and painting, trying to ignore the creeping sense that something bigger was unfolding behind the scenes. We decided to look into the two men. Brandon, with his military background, had contacts who could dig into just about anyone. It didn't take long for us to find out who they were, or, rather, who they weren't. The tall man, his name wasn't on any official HoA list. Stocky's name didn't show up either. Both of them were ghosts in the system. Something didn't add up. I made a call to the real HoA office, the one we'd been dealing with for years. The person on the other end of the line sounded just as confused as we were. There were no new initiatives. No compliance officers. No surprise inspections. Something was off. And it wasn't just the men. It was everything. As the days passed, Brandon started to get quieter. The adrenaline rush from the confrontation had faded, but I could still see the tension in his eyes. There was something gnawing at him, something deeper than just the men who had shown up. One evening, after we finished working on the fence, Brandon stayed behind, leaning against the post, his arms folded across his chest. He wasn't looking at the house. He was looking beyond it, as if staring into the horizon, seeing something none of us could. "Something's off about all this," he said finally, his voice low. "I've dealt with shit like this before. Not with the HoA, but with people who hide behind fake credentials. People who aren't what they claim to be." I raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Brandon didn't answer immediately. He looked back at me, and for the first time, I saw the weight of his past in his eyes. "They're connected to something. Someone. I don't know who yet, but I'll find out." And with that, the tension ratcheted up again. The fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. The next few days blurred into a haze of tension. The neighborhood remained deceptively peaceful, but something about the air seemed wrong. A low, humming current of unease ran just beneath the surface. Brandon was on edge, and so was I. We'd spent hours trying to piece together what had happened, the two men, their strange behavior, and the way they'd been willing to escalate so quickly. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were just pawns in a much larger game. Brandon had gone quiet, obsessively working through his contacts and his resources. But every lead we chased ended in a dead end. No one knew who the men really worked for. No one knew what their purpose was. They weren't affiliated with any of the local authorities. They weren't on any known HoA radar. One evening, just as I was starting to lose hope, Brandon came to me with a slip of paper, a name scrawled on it in his jagged handwriting. "Derek Nash," he said quietly, looking over his shoulder as if expecting someone to be listening. "He's a player in all this." I took the paper, but before I could ask any questions, Brandon held up his hand. "Derek Nash is tied to some pretty shady dealings. Real estate, HoA-related scandals, land deals under the table. He's been involved in legal gray areas for years. But it goes deeper than that. I'm sure of it." I glanced at the paper. The name meant nothing to me at first, but the more I thought about it, the more the pieces started to fall into place. The HoA wasn't just a group of disgruntled, self-important neighbors. This was something far more insidious. Brandon continued, his voice lower now, a reflection of his growing concern. "These guys, they weren't just there for a garden. It's not about the house, it's about what's under it. Whatever land rights or ownership interests Nash has, they're tied to this property." "Land rights," I repeated, shaking my head. "You're telling me the garden, the HoA fines, everything was just a distraction?" "Exactly," Brandon said. "Whoever is pulling the strings wants this property, for something more than just a suburban plot of land." The more I thought about it, the more it made sense. Every absurd rule the HoA had come up with seemed like a smokescreen. And those two men, just muscle, trying to intimidate us into giving up whatever hidden treasure lay beneath the surface. It was then I realized, we weren't just fighting against an oppressive HoA. We were fighting against something much darker. We were barely digesting the truth when another surprise came our way. It was early in the morning when the knock on the door came. I opened it to find Claire, the HoA president, standing on the doorstep, looking unusually serious. She wasn't her usual self, all smiles and insincere pleasantries. "Can I talk to you?" she asked, almost hesitantly. I stepped aside, not sure what to make of her sudden visit. "Come on in," I said, keeping my guard up. She entered, looking around nervously before sitting down at the kitchen table. Brandon stood at the window, his back turned, but his posture stiff. We weren't expecting any kind of peace offering from her. "I need your help," Claire said, her voice strained. "You're not the only ones who've been targeted." I raised an eyebrow. "Targeted? What are you talking about?" Claire looked over her shoulder, almost as if to ensure we weren't being watched. Her voice dropped even lower. "The HoA, the real HoA, isn't just about fines and property control. It's a front. There's a bigger organization behind it, one that's been quietly taking over properties in this area for years." Brandon turned, his interest piqued. "What do you mean?" "Derek Nash," she whispered. "He's been using the HoA as a cover. He manipulates the system, gets people to sell, buys up the land without anyone noticing. This isn't just about a garden or a house. It's about control of everything around here." Claire leaned forward, her hands shaking. "I'm not a part of it. I've tried to stop it. But Nash, he has everyone in his pocket, including some of the local officials. I don't know who to trust anymore." It was almost too much to process, but Claire's words were starting to paint a chilling picture. The garden, the fines, the fake inspections, they were all part of Nash's grand plan. He wasn't interested in just this one property. He wanted the whole neighborhood. And if he got it, who knew what else he'd be able to do? Brandon exchanged a look with me. We both knew what had to happen next. "We need to expose Nash." "All of it," Brandon said firmly. Claire nodded, her eyes wide. "I'll help you. I'll give you everything I know." The following days were a blur of secret meetings, stolen information, and tense phone calls. Claire turned out to be an invaluable ally, providing us with copies of old HoA documents, secret emails, and financial statements that detailed how Nash had been systematically purchasing properties in the area under false pretenses. We had enough evidence now to show that Nash wasn't just after a few cheap houses. He was working on a massive land grab. But what for? Brandon's contacts helped us piece together more of the puzzle. Nash's company was listed as the owner of several development projects in the area, all of which turned out to be tied to offshore accounts and shell companies. The deeper we dug, the more the whole thing stank of corruption. It wasn't just a few bad apples. It was a well-oiled machine. Then Claire gave us one last piece of the puzzle, a letter she'd intercepted that detailed an upcoming land auction. Nash was planning to buy up a swath of homes in the area at a fraction of their value, forcing people out and flipping the properties for a massive profit. What's he planning to do with it? I asked, reading over the letter. Build more luxury homes. Claire shook her head. Worse. He's planning to sell it all to a developer who wants to turn it into a resort. All the land in the area. It'll be a gated community. Everything, the homes, the stores, the parks, all gone. Brandon clenched his fists. We have to stop him. It wasn't long before we realized that the only way to stop Nash was to confront him directly. The land auction was only days away, and if we didn't act fast, it would be too late. Brandon's military instincts kicked into overdrive. We gathered everything we could, including the evidence Claire had provided, and set a plan in motion. We'd confront Nash in person, expose him to the public, and expose the corruption behind the entire HoA operation. It wasn't a decision we made lightly, but it was the only option we had left. That night, as the auction loomed closer, we stood outside the venue where Nash's company was holding its event. The weeks following the auction were a blur. Nash's plans were ruined, but the battle wasn't over. The fallout from the exposure spread far beyond the neighborhood, leading to multiple investigations, arrests, and the eventual collapse of Nash's entire operation. The HoA, once a tool of power, was dismantled, and the neighborhood was free from the shadow of corruption. Brandon and I had saved our home, but more importantly, we'd saved everyone else's. And as we stood on the porch that evening, Grandma by our side, Brandon turned to me with a smile. We did it, he said simply. I nodded, but in my heart, I knew we had just begun to unravel something far bigger than we could have imagined. But that's a story for another day.